And it's just delightful to be here this morning with Diana Butler Bass. I got to hear her speak several times when I lived in the Diocese of Chicago. She did a lot of work with the diocese, and I was so excited when I found out that she could be with us here at St. Paul's. So with that, let me go ahead. Oh wait, I can't forget. I do have a little bit of housekeeping I wanted to share before I introduce her. Everyone will be muted except for Diana and myself and Jesse throughout this forum. It will be live streamed to Facebook, and a recording will be posted to YouTube afterwards. So you can go back and take another look, or other people will have a chance to watch it. The chat has been set up so that you will only be chatting with the host, with Jesse. And please submit, if you have questions for Diana, please submit them through the chat to Jesse, and then we'll have a chance later on to take some of those questions. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce Diana. She is an award-winning author and internationally known public speaker and thought leader on issues of spirituality, religion, culture, and politics. She has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, PBS, CBS, and Fox, and has been interviewed on numerous radio programs, including shows on NPR, CBC, and Sirius XM, and has work featured in numerous print and online newspapers and magazines, including Time, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Times. From 1995 to 2000, she wrote a weekly column for the New York Times Syndicate. She was a founding blogger for both BeliefNet and Huffington Post Religion. Her bylines include the Washington Post and Atlantic.com. She has preached and taught in hundreds of churches, colleges, and conference venues in North America and beyond. Diana is the author of 10 books, the most recent being Grateful, the Transformative Power of Giving Thanks, in which she offers suggestions for reclaiming gratitude that can lead to greater connection with God, our loved ones, our world, and even our souls. And I think we did send around to all of you a link to one of her articles talking about religion and politics, the necessary conversation. So I wanted Diana to start there. In this article, you talk about an email you received from a pastor at a church where you were preparing to speak. And the pastor was asking you to avoid the political piece in your talk, citing that one of the church's primary values was being nonpartisan. I'll just tell you my story. When I came to St. Paul's, it was made clear to me that I was not to preach politics. And we do have a politically mixed congregation. We struggle to find that balance between being followers of Jesus and staying nonpartisan. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how we live out this tension with our church and maybe even in our personal lives.
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, I started the article with that note that I got, because I have an entire file of notes like that. So it's not just a, sort of a one-time thing. I have gotten notes before I went to preach in a congregation. I've gotten angry notes after I've been in a church, not usually from the clergy, but sometimes from, members of a church. And it always baffles me a little bit when I see that note come across my desk. It's like, don't talk about this. And my first reaction whenever I get that kind of note is, well, what do people actually think that Jesus talked about? Because in the New Testament, we have all kinds of examples of Jesus talking about politics. I mean, as soon as he invites a tax collector to dinner, that's a political act. He's not just doing something religious. He's violating sort of the the political standards of his day, and that is Jews didn't hang out with people who collaborated with the Romans. And so when he invites a tax collector, he's violating what their expectation is of how a good Jew is supposed to act politically in his own day. And then we have that whole discussion about Jesus and taxes. You know, it's something we still don't understand really what Jesus was saying: render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and things that are God's to God. And so when I get that note about how we're nonpartisan, don't talk about politics, and then I look usually at the reading from the New Testament, I think, how in the world is that not political? And so I've spent an enormous amount of time in my life as a writer, but just also as a Christian person, reflecting on what is really going on with this question. You know, what is going on with this argument, this demand? And, you know, I think there's a couple different things, but first of all, we don't often we don't recognize what's going on in the New Testament as political because it's not our politics. And so when we read the New Testament, we're reading a document whose context we don't understand. And so we think Jesus never talked about politics because, you know, he wasn't talking about Republicans and Democrats, and he wasn't talking about, you know, voting rights or racial issues or what have you. He was talking about a different political setting. And so I always think that that's one of the most important things for Christians to become literate in, is to understand what the politics was behind the New Testament. And when we understand that, then we begin to see, well, wait a second, Jesus really was addressing politics. And that, of course, heightens the fact of what we know about his execution. His execution wasn't just a religious act, it was a political act primarily. That was how it was seen by the people who executed him. And so to me, knowing all those things, it becomes very difficult not to engage in some level of politics, you know, in just the simplest conversations about Jesus. So I think that the church has kind of failed at that point, is to really be able to help people understand that when we live together in a culture, in a society, that the following Jesus somehow cuts against the political cultures of whatever day that's happening in. Another great example would be, and this is just from this month, you know, St. Francis. And, you know, St. Francis starts out being a wealthy young man who went off to the Crusades. So he was a soldier. And so as a wealthy young man and as a soldier, there were certain things that he did in the political and economic life of medieval Italy. And yet what happened to him is when he got back from the war, you know, he was in a terrible state. He had been injured, wounded, and when he recovered, it was when he recovered that he began to have these visions of God, and those visions were very different. And what St. Francis ultimately, when he responded to those visions, he began to make really radical political statements. First of all, stripping off all of his clothes, turning away the wealth of his father. And his father was very upset at him because Francis was not going to go into the cloth business, which was a big global corporation, essentially, in 1200 that Francis would have inherited. So he rejected the wealth of his father. He becomes a peacemaker. He rejects, actually, the policy of war that his kingdom had toward Muslims in the Holy Land. And then he embraces the poor. And so all of those things, and the poor were considered outcasts, less than Christian, they didn't really count. And so he goes to the margins of his society. And so the New Testament is political, but then when we look at some of our very favorite saints, their actions of following Jesus immediately plunge them into a political realm when they're taking that journey really seriously. And they often then make choices that are countercultural to the politics of the day. So these are things that I think that the church just needs to learn how to talk about better. And we don't live without somehow our lives touching into economic, political, and social realities that shape us and that sometimes must come under question because of our following of Jesus. So that's the main thing that I think is stopping the church from really talking about these things, is that we have failed in very significant ways to understand the nature of the environments in which Jesus lived, the environments in which the saints live, and the environments in which we live. And when we get that context right, I think it becomes a more passionate and interesting conversation, rather than just, well, who are you going to vote for? And, you know, if you vote for Joe Biden, you're voting for a socialist. If you vote for Trump, you're voting for a racist misogynist. And so, you know, if that's the level of our politics, I don't want any part of that, because that's just name calling. That's not politics. That's demeaning the dignity of other people and not really engaging racism, and not really engaging what it means to treat women as equals, and not really engaging political systems fairly and trying to figure out which one best aligns with the gospel. So I that's where I really want to see the church do some incredible work. And I think that will help reshape the complaint. You know, don't talk about religion and politics. And I always say, well, how can I help it?
Yeah, and actually, I think this touches on the next question. When you talked about, in your article, you talked about that God cares about the polis, the Greek word for the city, from which we get the word politics, right? And you talk about politics as caring for the life of the city. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit more, but what we are preaching is the gospel, and right, and then how we care for each other. Does that, I don't know if you have any further thoughts want to elaborate on that at all, but.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because so much of our language, I mean, about politics is really shaped by the media. And so when we think about the word politics, what do we think about? We think about Chuck Todd on MSNBC and the horse race, or we think about the moderators of the last debate who might have come from Fox News. And so we've allowed the language of politics to be shaped not by the deep language of ethics or classical sorts of ideas that have passed down through centuries as part of the inheritance in Western culture. But we just think about how people are going to vote. And we think of political parties. And I say in the article, one of the interesting parts of my life is I've belonged to pretty much every political party, and some of them multiple times. So I was born into a Democratic family in Maryland in 1959. Everybody I knew was a Democrat. There were no Republicans in the world I inhabited when I was a little girl. And then we moved to Arizona when I was 13, and it was the exact opposite. There were no Democrats in Arizona. And so my parents became Republicans, and I got really actually quite active in the Republican Party as a teenager. I was the chairperson of the Teenage Republicans of the state of Arizona, and I have a letter that was sent to me in 1976 from Senator Barry Goldwater, because he awarded me Arizona Teenage Republican of the Year. So once in a while, I've taken a photograph of that. Once in a while, I'll post it on Twitter when people yell at me for being too partisan. It's like, no. Believe me, I understand this from the inside. You know, not many of you have a letter from Barry Goldwater praising you and what a good Republican you are. So after that, though, I went to college, and I went to this evangelical college in California, and nearly everybody there were they were influenced by the Other Side magazine and Sojourners, and most of my friends were Democrats. There were some Republicans, but it was a little bit more mixed. But a lot of my friends in college were socialists. And I had this one very close friend in college who used to get a Cuban newspaper smuggled in from Havana, and we'd sit around and read it and compare it to our Bible and Bible study. So, you know, we think about these labels, you know, but when we look at our own lives, you know, our own lives are never easy journeys with Jesus or with politics. There's a lot of places, and I know this is true. I was looking at the faces of everybody when we came in, and it's almost impossible to be born one thing and stay that your whole life. And you know, I think about not only my own journey, but my father-in-law. I'm sorry about your mom, by the way.
Thank you.
That's a hard time. My father-in-law died in 2013, and he was a really interesting man. He actually went to Annapolis during World War II and was in the same class with Jimmy Carter. And it was, so my father-in-law, along with President Carter and a number of other very renowned Americans, became the core of the nuclear navy. And for a long time, my father-in-law worked for Admiral Rickover. And so I remember maybe about 8 or 9 years before he died, we were sitting around a table, you know, after Thanksgiving dinner or some big meal like that. And I asked him, I said, how do you feel now that you're in your 80s about what you did at the end of World War II in creating nuclear bombs and nuclear submarines? And I said, what is that? How do you understand that in relationship to your journey as a Christian? And I remember him leaning back in his chair, and he said, well, you know, at the time, it seemed like it was the only path. It was the best thing to do because we were trying to save America from this threat. And then he shook his head and he said, but it's not what I would choose now. He said, we didn't realize it, but we made the world less safe rather than more. And then he went on and talked about how he just thinks, how he thought then that was not a good choice for a Christian to make. And I was really struck by that, you know, how deeply engaged he was in a set of political events around the Cold War. And I mean, he was in the elite of the United States Navy. And yet he had allowed his Christian faith to travel with him on this path. And it had changed him as a person. It had clearly changed his own heart, but it had changed his political views. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if we're really honest with ourselves, you know, you could have dramatic flip-flops like me. I'm a end of the line baby boomer. And so we were allowed to have all kinds of crazy opinions and go back and forth and try all sorts of ideas on. Or you could go on a slow journey like my father-in-law and have contributed deeply to the making of one political and economic and social system, and then had a bit of regret about that towards the end of his life, where then he began to address those regrets by voting differently, by giving money to different causes, by lending his voice to his church. He was a member of a Presbyterian church in Annapolis, and he became a real leader there and engaged that congregation in, for example, rights of LGBTQ people. Before that was something that the military was doing, and also be involved in peace movements. So I always urge people to think about that. You know, where are you now that's different than where you were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 40 years ago? And understand that it's a journey as well as following Jesus. And then to ask the questions, how are those things interwoven? And, how do we express those in our lives? So I think it's really important. And a lot of us, I think, I know I can answer really clearly right now, right this minute. I'm on a new journey with thinking about racism and what it means to be a white person, and what I love from the stories and traditions I have inherited, and what needs to be corrected. And so if I just crossed my arms and said, no, I've got this all right and I'm not going to listen to anybody, well, that would not be a journey. That would be a closed book. But I do believe that most people who have hearts soft enough to truly follow Jesus also have hearts soft enough to truly understand where we're going in relationship to the world in which we live, and to examine and explore those things in terms of our politics, our racial views, our economic views.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that, because I have evolved myself in terms of political parties, in terms of the whole, the awakening to racism in our country. I do think you're right. It's just like our faith is a journey. Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the end of your article, you wondered aloud if perhaps the time for talking about religion and politics has passed, that there's so much anger and hatred and division in our conversation. So do you think there's any way to change that? That, where are we headed next if this time has passed? What are your thoughts on the future and how we live through this time of divisiveness?
You know what? After I wrote that, I thought, that's a little bleak. So what I do think is that this moment takes some serious discernment. And that is, again, I'm using some examples from my own life. Please fill in what you're thinking, on your side of the screen, everyone. But I can think of really, excuse me, two different examples in my own life. One which is bleaker and one which is very optimistic, that it goes right to this question. The bleak example is, sadly enough, from my own family. My brother and I have not talked since Charlottesville. And he posted something on Facebook about how he thought that Heather Heyer, despite the fact that he believed that, as a Christian, no one really deserved to die or should be murdered, he nevertheless said that if you're going to hang around with Antifa, you might get whatever comes your way. And that horrified me, that it came from my brother. And it horrified me because my daughter, his niece, was a student at the University of Virginia, and several of her friends were injured by that same car that killed Heather Heyer. And I was just, he could have been talking about his own niece, in other words. And I mean, I was also horrified because that was not how we were raised. And so I came back at him pretty forcefully on Facebook, and I was immediately blocked. He deleted that Facebook account. He blocked me on every other form of social media. I tried to send him an email, and my emails bounced back. He changed his phone number.
Oh my goodness. And
so literally, I do not know. I have not had any communication with my brother since that time. He has not reached out to me. He has not, and I've used this example several times now in articles, just to talk about, I'm a public person, and I love Jesus, and I have a very soft and tender heart and all this kind of stuff. And yet this breakage, this violence that politics has done to so many of our relationships happened right in the heart of my own family. Mm-hmm. And it's left my sister, who is an amazing and wonderful person, has left her kind of in the middle of all this. Because although she and I are much more on the same page with certain kinds of social and political issues, and certainly are voting for the same candidate for president, she's nevertheless, I think, a little bit, she's a mathematician and not a writer. So let's just say her words are not as pointed as her sister's. So she sometimes is easier to talk to than me because she's thinking about numbers. And so anyway, but they still talk, but so I know my brother's alive. That's about it. And so that is one of the things I had in mind. You know, maybe the time has passed. My brother's a Catholic and takes it very seriously. He's a very conservative Catholic. And takes it seriously, but you know, he's a person of faith. I trust that he's following Jesus. The other example, which is more optimistic, is that in the last 4 years, I have become friends with more people who are members of the Republican Party here in Washington, D.C. than I was in the 8 years previous when Obama was president. And that includes interesting writers, people who literally were political operatives who I never thought that I liked when Obama was president or even when Bush was president. And now one of the things that's happened in my world of these kinds of writers and people who live in DC is that a lot of people here are actually talking about issues much more deeply than we were before. And the sort of the starkness of the Trump presidency has really emotionally upset a lot of very good Republicans. And so I literally, I mean, some of the people that I talk to now on a fairly regular basis via email about my work, or people who compliment me about my work, are people that I once thought were going to hell because of their political opinions, particularly about the Iraq War. And so there have been conversations and friendships for me that have opened up that were beyond imagining. So I think that there's kind of the both and of this moment is that, you know, quite honestly, what we have is we have a president whose personality is such that, you know, it's almost like the person, and we've all known people like this, who walks into a room and the room instantly divides. And you find yourself, it's like, oh, I don't want to be near that person, or you want to be completely close to that person. And what happens in that kind of situation when you have this very charismatic, very explosive kind of personality that in a leader, and I've seen this happen in churches as well, not just in political environments. I've seen it happen around rectors, is that you find yourself sometimes with people you didn't expect to find yourself. And so that's kind of one of the things I think that's happened a little bit, or quite a bit actually, because of this presidency. One of the groups that I think is very interesting right now are my friends, mostly people I knew out of the emergent church movement about 10 or so years ago. One of the leaders of that is a pastor from Minneapolis named Doug Padgett. And Doug founded a church called Solomon's Porch that was a very famous early emergent church experiment. And now he founded an organization called Vote Common Good. And they're going on bus tours all over swing states, talking to Christians about what does it mean to vote the common good. And it's a great project. And why I bring that up is that Doug, in doing this, he got approached by the people on the Lincoln Project,
Hmm.
of all things. And, you know, these never Trump Republicans with these big, edgy, you know, kind of really sort of mean commercials, you know, and yet, you know, here's these two groups of people that in any normal universe would never have wound up sort of talking to one another. And now Doug finds himself in conversation with some of these never Trump Republicans, not just only about this election, but about very important issues, about income equality, about racism, and other kinds of things that emerge very deeply out of a Christian vision for the common good. And so when I heard that the Lincoln Project people were interested in having conversations with Vote Common Good, I was almost no more, I mean, I almost couldn't breathe, because it just seemed to me so unlikely. And yet those kinds of things are happening. So we have the broken family, and then we have the new friendships. And so I think that just takes, as I start out this section by saying, I think it takes discernment in knowing how and where to invest ourselves. And so, you know, I realize that there is part of the discerning prayer with my brother is that there is no engaging him until he reaches out to me. Otherwise, that would be putting myself in a cycle of real emotional hurt. And so I've just decided to stay out of that conversation, as much as it pains me not to have any communication with my brother, until he comes to me and is able to say, hey, maybe I was too fast in cutting you off on Facebook, you know, and giving me a chance then to say, well, maybe I was too quick out of the gate in not trying to listen to what you're saying. But that can't happen on my end first. And that just comes through discernment. But yet this other place, you know, I've really discerned that there are some incredibly interesting and provocative people to talk to and to be part of their growth, actually in faith. A lot of those people never really had great theological conversations. You'd be surprised at how many people in the media are outside of theological and spiritual conversations. And now that they're sort of reaching towards people like myself or Doug Padgett or Jackie Lewis at Middle Church in New York City or Austin Channing Brown, and I mean, it's just really interesting that there is a new opportunity to really engage with some fairly influential people about faith and politics. Because it's become an important part of where we are right now in our culture.
Yeah, you know, you're making me, we're starting the Sacred Ground series here at St. Paul's this week. And one of the films that's part of the first session is, I think it's American Creed, which I was watching. And it's based on Condoleezza Rice and David Kennedy are teaching a class at Stanford with all first generation college students. And it's all about their stories and where their families come from. But one of the stories they tell in this film is about two people, one very progressive and one very conservative, one with the Tea Party, and how they somehow contacted each other and started meeting to talk. And one of the things they realized was they have far more in common than not. And what you're making me think about, Diana, is maybe because this climate of divisiveness right now is so awful, and because it's so apparent that what's going on is about behavior and value and lack of compassion and lack of integrity and all of those things, it has nothing to do with policy, right? What's so difficult, it's not policy. And so maybe it is drawing us in to say, hey, you know, what does that person think? And maybe this is exactly what pushes us, right? This behavior that most of us recognize is just not okay. Maybe that pushes us to want to have a conversation, to understand to understand and learn from one another, right? About what we believe and how we see the whole picture, right? If we could listen to one another. So I don't want to talk too much because I know there's so many questions out there. So Jesse, do you want to go ahead and jump in?
Yeah, thank you. It's been wonderful to both hear you guys, you, Diana and Jeannie, talk, but also to get the stream of questions from our people. And there are so many. I want to start with not an easy one, Diana, but this one comes in and it came up. I'm not quite sure what the context was for the gentleman who asked it, but it ties in a lot with what you were talking about with your brother and the pain of estrangement, which so many people feel and often don't talk about. So it comes in personally, but also more nationally when we are so divided. And here's the question. How do we begin to forgive people who don't think they've done anything that needs to be forgiven? And this is a question that goes beyond politics, but it is such a key question, I think, for people of faith who pray all the time about forgiveness.
Yeah. My last book, I actually talked about, and please, this might be a little triggering, I don't know for anybody who's sitting here, but my last book, I have a small section in the book on gratitude about having been sexually abused when I was 14 years old. And I talk about the question of forgiveness. And literally, it took me 35 years, maybe 40 years to get to some level of something that is recognizable as forgiveness in that situation. So I understand that forgiveness is incredibly difficult, and like our political lives and like following Jesus, it is as well a bit of a journey. So I have no illusions that this is a simple process. I think that part of the problem we're facing right now is that we have so personalized politics that we can't, and Jeannie was getting at it with the whole business about, we're not really talking about policy. We've really sort of moved it to some other realm. And so I use the example of Donald Trump being this big, charismatic kind of personality that engenders a lot of feelings very quickly. But he does that out of the force of his personality. But he also does it in another way that I think is really interesting and somewhat dangerous. And that is, people have, not every supporter of Donald Trump does this, but many have. And that is, somehow people who follow, who love Trump, I mean, now we're in the realm of loving the president, have somehow found their identity in him. And I think that was also, I think there was some level of that was encouraged during the Obama administration by the politics around the election of President Obama, is that people weren't just voting for an aspirational candidate, which Obama clearly was, and aspirational candidates are fine. And also they weren't just voting for a set of policies, but somehow there were progressives who found their identity in him. And that what we've done for the last 12 or 15 years, and it's interesting that it's happening at the same time religious identification is declining in America, is that this tendency to identify ourselves politically is growing, and that we're replacing identity with political party or political personality. And that's where, so this is why this becomes so difficult to talk about, is that sometimes you're arguing, like in the case of my brother, it is 100% the truth that he has discovered himself in some significant way in relationship with Donald Trump. It's a religious thing. It's the way I talked about Jesus when I was 16 and got born again. And so when you're in that realm, these kinds of concepts like forgiving people who have argued with you or trying to reknit my relationship with my brother, we've entered a different territory than simply someone being mean to you or someone transgressing against you. This is qualitatively different. So again, I think discernment is key. In the case of someone who has found their identity in either a president or say one of the more radical movements that have developed around the edges of politics, those people are very difficult to talk to. And I don't even know how to put the word forgiveness in a sentence there. But then there are a whole host of other people. And those are the people who, voted for Trump because they were Republicans, or argued with you because they really are troubled about a particular policy, and, upset Thanksgiving dinner because of that. And so that's the place where we're going to have to work on bringing things back together and finding forgiveness to one another for the wrongs we have done to each other politically. So I think that starting with discernment is key. Understanding the fact that we live in an environment that is where the lines of religion and politics have crossed in a way that are unproductive. And then I think once the temperature lowers a bit across the culture, that it's going to be easier to engage in some of the conversations right now that we think might be impossible. And that comes out of my historical sense. I was trained as a historian, and, it would have been absolutely impossible to have a rational conversation with pretty much anybody in the United States in 1865 about Abraham Lincoln. He was an incredibly divisive figure, North and South. And then when he was killed, he was essentially elevated to the level of Messiah by mostly the people in the North. I mean, there were hymns written to him, poems. I remember when my specialty area was 19th century American religion and politics, right in the Civil War period. And I remember when I first read that material, it was amazing, the things that were said about Abraham Lincoln. It was the Trinity, was God the Father, Jesus Christ, and Abraham Lincoln. And so in that environment, it was impossible to have a rational conversation about anything related to politics. And what had to happen is that the temperature had to drop. You had to get a few years out from that. And that's when you begin to have assessments and begin to have conversations and begin to look at the political situations differently. And so I'm not sure better in the case of Reconstruction, but nevertheless, it was explored differently once you got past a certain emotional point. And so I think that's what we're going to have to just do. There will need to be a cooling off period of some sort or another. And I hope that comes sooner rather than later.
Thank you. We got a flood of a couple of responses to that last answer. And one thing that I'm wondering if you can help parse out for us. So we've had this distinction that we're making of policies being personal and personalization of politics and the identity of politics. So this is such a complicated issue, and it's a hard one with language, but can you talk about the fact that that politics is inherently personal, and there are people for whom these decisions, like, they can't choose to disengage because it's actually their livelihood. I'm thinking, and you talked about the people on the margins at the beginning and the people who Jesus was really tied to. So how do we make sense of that difference and also navigate that faithfully, that yes, we can't over personalize, and yet for some people it's not a choice?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And if I didn't make myself clear, this is a chance to do it. We should not personalize the personalities. So I should not be putting all of my eggs. I love Barack Obama. I got to work on the ACA at one point. I went to the White House, the whole deal. It was amazing, and it's one of the highlights of my professional life. But when and if Barack Obama became, on the level of a messiah, and I find my identity in his personality, that's what I mean by politics becoming personal, is that we personalize the party and the person, and that becomes part of who we are. And we're seeing that with certain Republicans, with Trump and Trumpism. And so that's what we need to reject. But policy is always personal. And I do not think that policy can ever be talked about in a truly removed way. And we do see this in contemporary politics quite a bit, is that the introduction of narrative and storytelling and personal testimony vis-a-vis policy has become a really important part of how we communicate what the common good can or should be. And I think that's not only legitimate, I think that is absolutely required. And so in that case, we're not finding ourselves in a person other than, as Christians, finding ourselves in Jesus or a party label, but instead we're finding ourselves in a quest for the flourishing of all Americans. Mm-hmm. And for being able to finally to listen to all stories and to make sure that all people are treated with dignity. And so you see how and it's very personal. And for me, it becomes incredibly personal, backed up to my baptism vows. I mean, that's my primary. I don't often write about that in public because I'm writing towards a very big religious public. But when I'm with Episcopalians, I don't mind saying that at all. But every single policy thing that I care about, everything that comes across my plate politically, I back that up immediately to those baptism vows. And I ask myself, is this about justice? Is this about respecting the dignity of every human person? Is this about what I think I'm being called to do through the waters of baptism? And and that's personal, man. And boy, I'll go to the mats on that one.
Thank you.
So I hope that answers the question.
It does. That was really helpful clarification. And I also, that helps us root down. And I think your answer was a great example of how we can navigate politics in a nonpartisan way, which is to root down into the promises that we made and that our godparents made in some cases on our behalf and our parents. And I want to wrap up with this last question about, as we prepared for your visit today, we talked about having perspective and how to keep perspective in a tough political time. And I think your baptismal covenant answer begins to answer that question. And I wonder, as we wrap up this really rich conversation today, if you can give us some sending words. I loved your sermon today with the successive benedictions of Paul. If you can give us some words about how to keep perspective as faithful followers of Jesus in incredibly tough political times.
Oh gosh. I was really struck in both preparing the sermon and in the piece that you picked out, the talking about religion and politics, the necessary conversation. I didn't plan it that way, but in both of those cases, I honed in on beautiful words. And so in the talking about religion and politics piece, I talk about irony, humility, lament, charity, forgiveness, generosity, neighborliness, hope, hospitality, justice, and compassion. And those words actually, this little article is a summary of a book that I wrote a long time ago called Broken We Kneel. And it was a book that was re-released last year by Church Publishing. And those words are the chapters of that book. And so I had already written a book about religion and politics that covered each one of those beautiful things. And those are such beautiful words. And we don't really think about them in relationship to politics. We think about politics, again, you know, the horse race, the charts, the winning, the losing, the yelling. But we don't think about lament as part of politics. Yet, how much right now mourning and lament actually need to be part of our politics, the politics that is developing around COVID. Because when we don't go into lament and mourning, we're missing a huge part of the story of what is emerging as a political and economic crisis in addition to a health crisis. And so these beautiful words take us somewhere that we wouldn't naturally go. And they're the ones in the article are all key themes in scripture. And then of course in the sermon, I talk about other beautiful words. You know, let your gentleness be known to all. I mean, it shocked me when I looked at the Greek levels of that word, the meanings of that word, and to find that one of the meanings is a justice that goes beyond ordinary justice. So it doesn't mean meekness, but it means let your justice exceed the justice that the world would normally give. Let your gentleness be known to all. And then I was also really struck by Paul's list of those virtues. And the first one that he mentions in the second benediction is truth. Whatever is true. And again, I looked up I spent a lot of time this week looking up each one of these words in Greek and understanding their context and how Paul was using them. And that word true actually means to be factual. I mean, literally, the Apostle Paul cares about us being factual with one another. And I think that if that would be the one thing that churches could do in this political environment and to move us ahead, not just in this election, but whatever comes after the election and then whatever is going to come over the next couple of years, is that the truth we bear is, yes, indeed, a theological truth. The truth will set you free, the truth of God and Christ, but it is also, according to the Apostle Paul in this text, factual truth. And that Christians are committed to both of those things, the theological truth of the story that we have inherited, the story we live, and being people who care about truth, about facts. And I think that the more we can talk about that becomes part of our ability to move people ahead. But there were a whole bunch of beautiful words as well. And truth is, I think, a number one beautiful word right now, that if we can all embrace that in the fullness that it is meant in our tradition, that we could really help to heal what is broken in our society. So the beautiful words, think on those things, ponder them, and practice them.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, Diana, I just want to thank you so much again for being with us. I hope everyone here has a chance to look at the service if you haven't already. I will say this morning, the music is beautiful, and the Carter kids reading the prayers of the people is about the cutest thing you've ever seen. So I hope you enjoy that too. But Diana, thank you so much for your words. What I heard in your sermon this morning is that our faith, it prioritizes our life. And with that, we know God's peace, which really sustains and nurtures us through all. So I have been listening to your words for many years now. I'm so grateful. I will continue to look for your prophetic words, and just thrilled that more people are getting to know you and just thank you so much for being here this morning. Really great.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was really nice to see your face again, and remember being in the Diocese of Chicago with you, and really a pleasure to be able to talk about these hard issues in a very open way. And to anyone who might have felt awkward about the discussion, please forgive my enthusiasms when necessary. And then anyone who was thrilled by the discussion, I hope that you'll go ahead and employ some of the things I suggested. We've all got choices to make. I know Ohio is a tough place to live right now, and I'm praying for you all, and may we always be people of beauty and truth.
Thank you. Thank you. Everyone have a wonderful day.